Big news today. Justin Jefferson, Minnesota Vikings star wide receiver, arguably the best wide receiver in the entire National Football League. That hamstring injury that he picked up during the game at the weekend, serious enough to land him on IR, meaning that he will miss at least the next 4 games.
Serious enough. No, I'm kidding. I don't think he's faking the hamstring injury. But it obviously does bring up the conversation. Vikings are sitting here at 1-4 now. And they're in a really intriguing spot, right? Because I actually don't think the Vikings are a complete dumpster fire. If you take away a lot, like even if the turnovers just regress to the mean, like to the middle, this team maybe has 1 extra win, maybe 2 extra wins because of how close some of those games were. Like maybe the Chargers game is different. Maybe the Buccaneers game is different, right? This could be totally different if they just weren't catastrophically terrible at giving the football away. So you figured at some point in the season that was going to turn back towards the normal side of things for them. And they were going to win a lot of games. But at that point, was it going to be too late for Minnesota? Like, were they going to be fully out of playoff contention? And all of a sudden, they're winning these games in the back half of the season that do nothing more than ruin their draft pick and ruin their spot to collect their next franchise quarterback because we know Kirk Cousins is not going to be on this team next year. So now, I'm not saying that your star receiver getting hurt is best case scenario. You're not going to hear those words come out of my mouth. However, since it did happen, little silver lining here is this guy's out for 4 games. If you don't have Justin Jefferson, a good chance the Vikings aren't winning. I don't even know what their schedule is. Do you have their schedule up right now?
No, but I can get it in a couple of seconds.
Because I wonder what their next 4 games are. Because Justin Jefferson being on IR means he's at least missing these 4 games.
Their next 4 games at Chicago, then home against San Francisco, then at Green Bay, and at Atlanta.
Okay, so, man, only one of those is a 100% guaranteed you're losing the game, and that's the 49ers. It's kind of good news for them then if you are a fan of them getting the best draft pick possible, that they don't have their best player against 3 teams in the Bears, the Packers, and the Falcons that they could beat. Because if you lose those, if you go 0-4 over this next stretch and you're sitting here at 1-8, all of a sudden you become what I would assume is massive sellers near the trade deadline. And then you are actually in on leading into the rebuild, being okay with losing these games, being able to turn the page and look forward and get the quarterback that you honestly need to jumpstart the franchise. Because you and I have talked about this on this very show. The Vikings don't pick in the top 10 very often. They just don't. And they've never really had that opportunity. This might be their opportunity. You never want to see a player go down. You never want to see a player get hurt. But in the long-term things, now that Jefferson is on IR, this might be the push that the Vikings needed to actually decide, okay, we're fully moving on from a lot of things on this roster and being able to get a good draft pick out of it.
Yeah, I mean, if this ends up putting them in a position, as you say, like 1-7, you know, where they're clearly staring down the barrel of a top 5 draft pick at some point, what do you actually do? Because presumably at that point, the season's dead. All you're fighting for is respectability. But realistically, at that point in the season, the draft pick becomes more important than, you know, pride. Right? At least in terms of what you want to get out of this. From a player's point of view, it's a different thing. So what do you actually do at that point if you're the Vikings to try and target that draft pick? Because suddenly your entire approach to the season needs to change from an institutional point of view, but the players and the coaches don't want anything different. They still want to win the next game. So how do you actually ensure now that we are officially tanking for this top draft pick? You say you turn to be sellers at the trade deadline. They don't actually have that many pieces that you would, there's not that much to sell on the roster currently, which is why they're losing a lot of games.
Well, who is it? Hunter is the big one?
Hunter would be the obvious one, yeah. But after that, it's like, what are you selling?
Yeah. I think Hunter is the one that you would probably move on from. And, you can think about this too. I don't know if these sides can necessarily collude or agree, but Jefferson's about to sign a mega deal. Right? He's probably going to be the highest wide receiver He's going to sign the highest wide receiver contract in the NFL. If the Vikings are even 2-7, even 3-6 when he's about to come back, like, is this dude really pushing himself to hurt himself more before he signs that contract? No. I mean, I don't want to say definitively no, but at least it's in the conversation. So the way that you really get to that point of saying that you're kind of tanking without fully coming out and tanking is, yeah, you probably sell Danielle Hunter near the trade deadline. And Jefferson doesn't play many games the rest of the season. And I think those are the two important factors for this team if they want to get a draft position that's anywhere close to a quarterback like Drake May or Caleb Williams.
The other interesting thing would be if any team is in a position where Kirk Cousins is attractive at that point, right? Because you're moving on from him anyway.
You and I have talked about that, and I think that's the correct move, but can you even do that?
Yeah.
That's the one that might be too far, right? That's the one where you go, okay, you are actively trying to field the worst roster possible. Yes. And that's just not something that we've seen very much, especially in the modern NFL. So I agree with you completely, especially putting Jefferson on IR for the next 4 games, depending on these next 4 games go. I would have told you that selling Cousins would have been the right price. And who knows, maybe behind the scenes, maybe they have sent those text messages or those calls to other GMs just to be like, hey, you know, like maybe they have done that, but if they haven't yet, I think that the situation has now presented itself for them to do so.
It's not the easiest trade in the world to make happen for a number of reasons. Number one, Kirk Cousins has a no trade clause, so he'd have to buy into wherever they're going.
It's true.
Number two,
yep.
He's going to want an extension wherever he's going. So in 2 separate ways, any prospective team needs to get Kirk Cousins to buy into this situation, which dramatically reduces the field in terms of teams that would even be in the conversation. Like the Jets are not in the conversation because Cousins is not going to sign up to be a relief pitcher for Aaron Rodgers for, a period of the season and then leave. That's just, I would imagine, very unlikely to be of interest to him. Whereas, I mentioned Atlanta before. Like if the Falcons can convince Cousins that if he steps onto this roster, they're a playoff team and a real contender, and they're willing to give him the extension that he wants. And by the way, we've got Drake May and Drake London and Kyle Pitts and Bijan Robinson and a pretty good offensive line. Like you could do some real damage here. Maybe that's viable, but they would need to be good enough that even at the deadline, they're good enough to convince Kirk Cousins of that, and they're bad enough that Desmond Ridder has clearly shown he's not the guy to take them there. So there's really not that many teams where it's even possible. And then, the Vikings are going to get a comp pick for Cousins if he leaves in the offseason, so it's got to be a good enough trade that they're interested, that it's better than what they're going to get anyway, and enough to offset the fact that you would be advertising openly that you have thrown in the towel this season. So
yeah, and that's why it's been hard to kind of make it make sense. I think you would love, if you're all in on the Vikings losing a lot of games and getting a very high draft pick, I think that you try to formulate a way where this is possible. But because of the reasons that you named, it does make it difficult. You have the no trade clause. You're probably going to get something for him in a comp pick anyways, just because of the nature of the contract that he's going to sign as a quarterback. It's unlikely that somebody would trade you something that's better than that comp pick, honestly. Because of what you said, you've got to trade a draft pick and then you've got to sign him. And there's just not a lot of teams. Like I could think, all right, I can envision Kirk Cousins being in New England next year. So would they be interested? Well, probably not, just because they would say to themselves, why would we give up a draft pick for Cousins when we could just sign him in free agency?
Yeah, we'll just wait a few months.
Right, and we don't have to do that. So the environment to trade him is getting less enticing, it feels, the longer the season is going on, because teams are getting out of that zone of we're fooling ourselves that we're competitors, and we're getting to the point where there's the contenders and the pretenders. And once you become in that pretenders category, you're not going to give up an asset for a quarterback that's just going to win you a couple of extra games this year. So the Cousins aspect does make sense, but Hunter is the trade piece that I think everybody would want if he ends up getting moved. then you know that the Vikings are
Done.
not all in on being competitive
Yeah,
this season.
done with the season.